Okay, so now, chapter 6 and 7, Nicomachean Ethics, book 2. Going more deeply, not surprisingly, into the concept of arete. What is it all about? Because remember, for eudaimonia, activity of soul, and ultimately it's going to be a human activity, a specific human activity of soul in accordance with arete. So everything turns on what this arete stuff is. We've seen there's a couple of different types of it, the intellectual arete, the character arete. Intellectual arete, mostly to the side for now. We're dealing with character arete, so we're dealing with emotions and getting those things under control. We're dealing with pains and passions, getting those things under control. Getting the right attitude and ways of feeling these things under control. Basically, to get them under control is to feel them in the right way, and that's what the discussion here is continuing to center on. All right, so virtue is a disposition of the soul, a tendency of it. That's the general definition. So let's push it a little further. What kind of disposition are we talking about? So certain dispositions we've already seen, and we've got some hints about this, because Aristotle's already talked a little bit about excesses and deficiencies and whatnot. So the right kind of disposition of the soul is going to be basically a disposition that tends to hit the right target, right? And of course, now you think about it, when you go to any kind of target practice, that's the hardest thing, is to hit the target. It's easy to not hit the target. So if I say to you, oh, well, we're going to go, I don't know, shoot a bow and arrow or something, and I say, okay, go for the bullseye over there. Well, it's easy to not hit the bullseye. If I said, well, try not to hit the bullseye, that would be pretty easy. But if I say, try to hit the bullseye, well, that's a very specific thing. That's harder. So this gives us an idea why being good, according to Aristotle, is hard, because you're trying to hit a bullseye. You're trying to develop the tendency to hit a bullseye. Again, like a skill, right? So a good archer, she walks in and, yeah, her tendency is to hit the bullseye all the time. While somebody who's a good person, his or her tendency, disposition of soul, is to hit the bullseye. And in this case, the bullseye is the notion of a mean. We'll talk a little bit about that. So in general, all virtue, all arete in the broad sense of that term, remember it's a bigger term than just moral or anything like that. All virtue, all arete makes its possessor, Aristotle says, both good and able to do something well. The arete, for instance, of the arete, shall we say, of an eye, right? The virtue of an eye makes the eye good and to see well. And again, we're so used to talking about virtue in a moral sense. Remember, it's a broader notion for Aristotle. That's why I say sometimes you shouldn't always run to a translation, because it can sort of skew your reading. But the arete of an eye, the arete of a knife, it makes it a good knife and it can cut well. Aristotle talks about the arete of a horse, makes it a good horse, and it's useful. It can do things that you want a horse to be able to do, like, be a good horse to carry you around or transport goods or be in war or something like that. So naturally, the arete of a human will make that person good and do good things and perform their particular characteristic well. So let's be a little bit more specific. So, and that brings us now to the notion of a mean. And it's important to remember, or to first off, to never make the mistake of thinking a mean is the same thing as moderate. So Aristotle is not advocating a doctrine of moderation. That's a common mistake that people say, oh, he's just saying be moderate all the time. No, he's not saying that. As a matter of fact, that's very different than what he's saying. Aristotle would never agree with statements like, well, the truth is always in the middle or something, or moderation is the truth. No, he would never agree with something like that. There's all kinds of problems when you say things like the truth is always in the middle. No, that's actually a fallacy, but that's a topic for another time. So, before we go into anything more with the virtue stuff and the mean, it's important to recognize the distinction that Aristotle makes. Okay, as I said, it's not a doctrine of moderation. The mean is not the moderate. But he makes a distinction here. If you recall, he talks about, ethics is a different thing to learn than mathematics. So you can have a mean with respect to the thing itself, kind of a mathematical sense. Then you can have a mean with respect to us. That's the ethical sense. What's the difference? It's actually not that difficult. And I've already talked about, you could think about the mean. I've already discussed it when I gave you the rock example in a previous film about how something is, what's good for something is going to be tailored towards a particular subject in a particular circumstance. Okay, let's back this up a little bit. Let's look at the example that Aristotle uses with food. Thinking about food. Very simple example. Aristotle, most of examples are quite simple, quite straightforward, and if you pay close attention to them, because they are there to make the more general concepts and abstract concepts easier to handle. They're an entry point. We always start to learn about the more complex and difficult from and foreign, shall we say, from the simple and local. That's Aristotle's epistemological or pedagogical principle, if you like. So consider food. Let's say you have, Aristotle said, well, I'm changing a little bit, but let's say you have about 10 kilograms of food. And he says something like this. We can think about the mean in two ways. The mean with respect to the thing itself. If you were to say that, oh, well, zero is a little food, and the 10 is a lot. Okay? So 0 kilograms of food is a little, well, none. Or if you say maybe 0 or 1, or that's make it a little more sense. So let's say just, 2 kilograms is a little, 10 kilograms is a lot. Well, the mathematical mean, of course, would be simply finding the middle of that, right? So you would add the 2 and the 10, and there you go. It's 6. So the mathematical mean is something that you can calculate, and you're only talking about, in this sense of the mean with respect to the thing itself, that's the food, right? So you just say, oh, well, 2 is a little, 10 is a lot, 6 is your mean. Simple. But that's a little bit different with respect to us now, because now you're taking a certain individual into account. So, as Aristotle says, well, you might say that, sure, you could say that 2 is a little bit of food, 10 is a lot. But if it's a mean with respect to us, you'd have to say, well, who's us? Who are you talking about? So, in one sense now, the mean of food, like what's sort of the desirable point here is going to be contingent on the situation. Not a matter of simple choice, but it could be something that is contingent on the situation, but fairly objective properties within that situation. So don't think that it's just totally random when I say it's contingent on a situation. It's just not mathematical. So in this sense, 2 kilograms of meat, we might say, is a little, 10 is a lot, but it depends on who we're talking about now. Because for somebody here, let's say who's quite small, we might say, well, 2 is a little, but let's say 3 is just right. That would be the mean for a particular, so let's say 3 for person 1. So the mean would be something that's relative to that person. Aristotle uses the example of 10 being a lot, but for a wrestler, like Milo the wrestler, was this large wrestler and athlete at the time, may need something like 10 kilograms of food, and in that sense, that would be a mean for him. So the mean is sort of like, kind of like the Goldilocks thing. Well, all things considered, and the consideration has to include the particular, this is just right. So the mean is kind of the just right thing, according to right reason, which is now going to include looking at the mean with respect to us. Not a mathematical type of calculation. So it's not, this is actually way simpler, right? It's easy to calculate a mathematical mean with all these things. You can have a simple formula that works independently of the situations. But calculating a mean in the ethical sense is a different game, Aristotle says. It's much more difficult. So this notion of the mean with respect to virtue, though, is dealing with the character virtues. And I'll get a little bit more into that in the next chapter a little bit of what he means here. But just to make a few more comments to flesh this out. You can have the mean is with respect to virtue, the character virtues. So the mean for Aristotle is always with respect to character virtues. Okay? Not all virtues. So the intellectual virtues, they don't have a mean like this. So when people say, well, Aristotle's theory of ethics is that everything, like, it's a complete theory, and it's just simply a doctrine of the mean. That covers everything of ethics for Aristotle. That's not quite right. He's got more than that. He also says that means are going to be involved in dealing with emotions. So we've got to find the means of emotions, right? In how to have them just right in a particular circumstance. So you can have you can have excesses and deficiencies with respect to emotions, but not all emotions admit of excesses and deficiencies. So some emotions do. The emotions that admit of excesses, deficiencies will have a mean. Some emotions don't work like that. So emotions like spite or envy, think about that. Those don't admit of a mean. In other words, there's no proper amount of spite or envy. They are pretty well kind of excess to begin with. So Aristotle is not saying that all emotions can have a virtue structure placed on them. Only certain kinds of emotions can. So there would be certain kinds of emotions then, according to Aristotle, that you would try and just get rid of. You wouldn't try to get them under control. So in one sense, there are some kinds of emotions like spite and envy that Aristotle would say you don't try to just have a certain amount of spite. No, you shouldn't have any of that. You should try and get rid of all your spiteful tendencies and all envy. You should never feel that emotion. Try and get rid of that if you can. Other emotions, like and things like pleasure and all those kinds of things, those you control. You don't want to get rid of all of them. He doesn't really explain why certain kinds of emotions do not admit of a mean. He just says they don't. And that's an example there of Aristotle more or less picking up on the values of his society, because he will say things like, well, people agree that there's just certain kinds of emotions you should never have. That's a little bit of a tension when he said that we don't praise or blame people for their emotions. There are some kinds of emotions that we say to people, you shouldn't have those. And it kind of, I don't look at you as highly if you have those kinds of emotions like spite all the time or envy. There are also certain kinds of acts that don't admit of a mean, actions that don't admit of a mean either. For instance, things like theft and homicide. Aristotle will never say something like a little bit of theft, or you should moderate your amount of theft, or not moderate, but have a mean for theft or homicide or anything like that. These are just intrinsically bad. So we have to be clear that Aristotle's, shall we say, his virtue ethics is not like a complete theory. Again, it's not like it's not like math. It's not mathematical. It's going to be quite practical and quite local. So the talk of the mean again doesn't apply to the intellectual virtues. So a character virtue then is a disposition with respect to certain actions and emotions, not all of them. It's a disposition of the soul in which the mean is achieved. So that's ultimately what's going on, is that you have a disposition to achieve a mean with certain kinds of actions, certain emotions, not all of them. Some actions are just going to be just good actions. Some actions are just going to be bad. Other ones, and same with emotions, some are just good, some are just bad. And others are the ones that you want to regulate and get under control. So in other words, Aristotle's virtue theory kind of talks about those actions and emotions that are kind of already in the middle. They're not too extreme in either way. In other words, they admit of a mean. Now, of course, as I said earlier, when I gave you the bullseyes example, this is difficult, right? It's more or less easy to recognize the extreme kinds of emotions and actions and go, okay, well, I'm going to try and avoid spite. and homicide and those kinds of things. But the other things about, pleasures and things like that, that admit of a mean, that's when life gets both more interesting and more complicated, because it's difficult to hit a mean. It is, as I said, think of it like a bullseye. And we praise people who are good archers, they can hit a bullseye. We also praise people that can hit the mean in the emotions that admit of a mean. People that are good at that, they can do it over and over again. They have a disposition. That's being virtue. And again, it's not a doctrine of moderation. So if you look here at these Becker numbers, Aristotle gives you more or less his definition now of character virtue. And it is a complex one, but it's a disposition of the soul, the tendency of the soul. It involves rational decisions. So reason is in there. You're listening to reason in the sense that you're not just accepting whatever comes or whatever. Not like that. You have to listen to reason, and consisting in a mean relevant with respect to us. So it's not a mathematical one. So in that sense, you're going to be involved in looking at things from a reasonable point of view, but you're looking at particular things. So you don't just have a general rule that you can walk in and simply apply. It's going to be difficult. You have to make real choices as a subject and as an agent. So you can't just be, a person who learns a bunch of rules and then just simply follows the rules. That again is sort of the illusion of virtue. That's sort of like the virtuous zombie, which I said was an illusion. And of course, you can't just memorize things. And Aristotle, not here but in other places, refers to, when we talk about teaching ethics, think about the way that we teach it to children. We don't say, oh well, let's hope that when a person leaves an educational institute, or when a kid moves out of home, we say, well, I hope they've memorized enough rules to go along in life and be a good person. No, we say things like, well, I hope that I've taught this person and they've shaped their character, that they're going to be a good person and they will be able to handle all kinds of new situations and different things that they possibly have never seen before. And that is being a virtuous person, is when you can find the mean in new and difficult and radically new situations. So let's look now at chapter 7, after we've got our definition of virtue now. In chapter 7, Aristotle takes this notion of virtue, and he does what we could say is kind of a list of virtues. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but he talks about courage, dealing with, it's a mean regarding fear and confidence. Temperance, a mean regarding pleasures and pains. Generosity, a mean regarding the giving and taking of money. And so basically what he does is he lists a whole pile of virtues and talks about their deficiencies, their excesses, and the mean of them. So he gives us, shall we say, a kind of laundry list of appropriate virtues. And what are those virtues appropriate? Like, where does this list even come from? Well, a number of philosophers have complained that Aristotle's list just isn't derived, it's just shown, it's just given. Now, that is a bit of an unfair criticism, because Aristotle does say repeatedly, well, you got to start kind of in the society that you're in. Now, that society that Aristotle started in, is a strong patriarchy, that kind of structure, and we'll look for another video on that. I'm going to talk about the background, but for now, he is building on the certain kind of set of virtues that would be admired, shall we say, by someone of good birth and high standing in Athenian society. So it's not just a random list that just drops out of nowhere. It's basically Aristotle talking about what he thinks would be a virtuous person and embedded in society, namely his. So it's not something that's absolutely abstract. It's a very concrete notion, and so it relates to where Aristotle himself comes from. All right, so that's about it for this video. Stay tuned.